We welcome you to another Sunday School lesson. Sunday School is a gift from God. Obstacles and loss often block our efforts to accomplish something worthwhile. How can we overcome these setbacks in order to live lives that count for good? God intervened to help Jacob overcome seeming defeat by not only gaining many possessions but also escaping the wrath of a selfish and deceptive father-in-law. After fleeing from Esau, Jacob would become acquainted with God's discipline, at the hand of his uncle Laban. Jacob arrives in Haran and meets Rachel, his uncle's younger daughter, at the same well where the servant Eliezer met Jacob's mother Rebekah, some years before. Rachel introduces Jacob to her father, Jacob's uncle, Laban. Laban is excited and receives Jacob into his home. The older daughter is Leah. A month after Jacob arrived at his home, Laban asks Jacob to name his wages for his services. Because Jacob loves Rachel more than Leah, Jacob offers to serve his uncle 7 years in order to marry Rachel. After the 7 years, Laban tricks Jacob and gives Leah as his wife. But Jacob does not love Leah. So he decides to work 7 more years for Rachel. After serving him for a week, Laban also gives Rachel in marriage to Jacob. Leah would have 4 children quickly after marriage, while Rachel had none. An unintended outcome of Laban's deception was that it led to tension, envy, and competition between his daughters. Rachel was barren, but Leah was fruitful. Leah would personally bear 6 sons because the Lord saw she was unloved, and he opened her womb. In response to his grace, Leah would give her sons names that reflected her hope in and gratitude toward the Lord. Rachel envied her sister. After first demanding that Jacob give me children, or else I die, she resorted to what was customary during ancient Middle Eastern times. Rachel gave her slave, Bilhah, to Jacob as a surrogate, hoping she would produce an heir. She did. However, Leah responded by doing the same, giving over her slave, Zilpah. This competition would continue for years, with 10 sons and 1 daughter being born by 3 women, before Rachel ever conceived her first child. Our lesson starts with Rachel's bringing his first son. Verse 22 says, "Then God remembered Rachel, he listened to her and enabled her to conceive." After all her human efforts to have her own children are exhausted, God hears Rachel. It appears after Rachel could not get what she wanted because of her jealousy, anger, and manipulation, she then turns to prayer. She seems to have finally realized that children are a blessing that only God can give. It is to be received only by prayer through faith in God. By implication, God shut Rachel's womb. Now God listened with interest to Rachel or paid attention to her with the intent to answer her petition. Verse 23 says, "She became pregnant and gave birth to a son and said, 'God has taken away my disgrace.' Consequently God opened her womb." Oftentimes, God uses a temporary infertility to demonstrate his sovereign authority over the affairs of his people. However, we cannot say for certain why God shut Rachel's womb. After God allows Rachel to conceive and bear a child, she says that God has taken away her disgrace. That indicates that God's giving her a child has removed the social stigma that barrenness had placed on her. Verse 24 says, "She named him Joseph, and said, 'May the Lord add to me another son.' Therefore she calls the son Joseph, which means may he add." The name presents the birth of the son in a twofold light, removing the reproach of sterility and hoping for another son. While Rachel rejoices that God has removed the shame, she also prays, "May the Lord add yet another son to my family." This prayer was answered later with the birth of Benjamin, son of my right hand. However, his delivery led to Rachel's death. Verse 25 says, "After Rachel gave birth to Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, 'Send me on my way so I can go back to my own homeland.'" The birth of Joseph marks the beginning of a new era in the life of Jacob and his family. Jacob's agreement of 14 years of service with Laban, his uncle and father-in-law, has been completed at the birth of his 11th son, Joseph. His family has grown from one lone man who fled for his life from his brother, to a large family of 2 wives, 2 concubines, 11 sons, and a daughter. Although we don't have record of his age at this time, Jacob is no longer a young man. The most probable age would be 74 years, assuming he fled to Padan Aram at 60 years and served Laban for 14 years. Whatever the age, Jacob felt it was time to return home to start a new life with his family in the country God promised him, Canaan. Jacob approaches Laban after Joseph's birth to ask for permission to move back to his people and country. Jacob had never regarded Haran as home. He wants to stand on his own and build his own home, not in Haran, but in the land where he was born and raised, Canaan. Until now he has been serving his father-in-law Laban. He now wants to branch out on his own and go home. Verse 26 says, "Give me my wives and children, for whom I have served you, and I will be on my way. You know how much work I've done for you." It is customary in Jewish and other cultures that after one has served for a number of years, his master will let him go with his blessings. Based on the cultural norms of the time, it appears Jacob is aware of his rights as an apprentice or servant. Jacob served Laban 14 years, fulfilling his own part of the agreement with Laban, so it was time for him to leave with all his wives and children. According to their tradition, the Jews regard Canaan as home regardless where they live. They always return to their homeland. A similar idea is behind Jacob's approach to Laban for permission to return to his country, and appropriately so because of the Lord's covenant promise to Abraham. Verse 27 says, "But Laban said to him, 'If I have found favor in your eyes, please stay. I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you.'" It is amazing how common it is that people would acknowledge the truth about God but still worship idols like Laban. It is equally interesting how the Lord could, because of one righteous man, bless other people. For example, he said if he could find 10 righteous men in Sodom, he would not destroy the city. It is also important to understand that the Lord often blesses people not because they are good or righteous, but because of who he is. Verse 28 says he added, "Name your wages, and I will pay them." To make Jacob stay, Laban asks him to name his price and promises to pay it. Verse 29 says, "Jacob said to him, 'You know how I have worked for you and how your livestock has fared under my care.'" Jacob reminds Laban how faithful he had been to him and how his small flock has greatly increased since Jacob started serving him 14 years ago. Verse 30 says, "The little you had before I came has increased greatly, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I have been. But now, when may I do something for my own household?" Reiterating Laban's earlier assertion, Jacob says, "And the Lord hath blessed thee since my coming." Jacob continues and rhetorically asks, "And now when shall I provide for mine own house also?" That is to say, isn't it time for me to find my way and build up my own family? Notice while Laban attributes his blessing to the Lord using the practice of divination, Jacob credits it to the Lord through divine revelation. Verse 31 says, "What shall I give you?" he asked. "Don't give me anything," Jacob replied. "But if you will do this one thing for me, I will go on tending your flocks and watching over them." Desperate to get a direct answer, Laban repeats his question. He is prepared to give anything for Jacob to stay and continue serving him, so that the Lord would keep blessing him through Jacob. Laban is thinking only about himself. He wants Jacob to serve him in perpetuity so that he would be richer. The longer Jacob stays, the richer he would become because of God's blessing coming through Jacob. Here Laban epitomizes the selfish attitude of rich employers and business people toward their employees. Although Laban always strives to get the upper hand, Jacob knows to be watchful of him. He offers a new compensation scheme. Even if Laban swindles him again, he is confident that the Lord is the one who will bless him, not Laban. Verse 32 says, "Let me go through all your flocks today and remove from them every speckled or spotted sheep, every dark-colored lamb and every spotted or speckled goat. They will be my wages." Jacob offers to continue to tend to Laban's flock on one condition. The kind of sheep that Jacob has been herding are normally all white and goats all black. The number of speckled and spotted animals would usually be few. Jacob offers to take only the speckled and spotted animals as his wages, while all the solid white sheep and solid black goats, which are greater in number, would belong to Laban. This way Jacob makes sure that Laban will accept his terms that seem generous, trusting in his own ingenuity and in the Lord to prosper him. Verses 33 to 43 narrates Laban accepting Jacob's proposal. He separates the animals accordingly. Laban hands over Jacob's animals to his own children. They took them to a 3-day journey away from Jacob. Tells about Jacob getting more prosperous than Laban. He sort of set a Guinness record for most brown sheep born in a year, and Laban is dismayed. We learn that Laban tries to switch the deal at least 10 times. Now I get the speckled one and you can have the solids. God says, okay. Let them be solid. Laban sees the change and now he wants the solid ones again, but God switches too. And Laban can't win and God can't lose, and this shows us even more about the promised blessing. Then the Lord reminded Jacob of Bethel. God made a promise and Jacob vowed a vow. I am your God. It's time to go home. It's time to face Esau. And Jacob is able to say, okay, God. I trust you. I'll go. Our last verse says, in this way the man grew exceedingly prosperous and came to own large flocks, and female and male servants, and camels, and donkeys. The narrator explains how through wisdom and providence the Lord altered the course of nature in Jacob's favor. Jacob's flock greatly multiplies more than Laban's, to the envy of his children. Laban would repeatedly from time to time try to change the agreement, but each time Jacob's flocks grew in number. In the meantime, Jacob increased exceedingly. The intensity of Jacob's wealth burst out exceedingly in exceeding wealth, not only in sheep and goats, but also in male and female servants, camels, and donkeys. As a result, he incurred the envy and anger of Laban and his family. But God was with Jacob and his family. Our key verse says, God remembered Rachel, he listened to her and enabled her to conceive. Genesis 30:22. God never forgot Rachel, of course, but he heard her prayers and answered them in his sovereign timing. All in all, God is gracious, God is kind, and God is dependable even when we aren't. God remembers our hurts and our frustrations, and when all seems lost, all is won, because he is a God who is working even before we are speaking those desperate prayers. At times we fail the test, but there is forgiveness with God. In his working, his strengthening, and Jesus interceding, we are overwhelmingly conquerors through his blessings. What do we, like the anxious pre-promised land Israelite, learn and hold fast to about God and his promise from our lesson? 1. God fulfills the promise in his time and it can't be rushed. Think of those human customs and beliefs. Think of all the frustration and envy and strife and false accusations. God wasn't budging until he was ready, and once he was, no one could stop him. 2. God allows us to experience adversity to build our confidence in him. Why didn't God have Jacob born first? Why didn't God just strike Esau dead while Jacob was at home? Why didn't he send Laban and his daughters to Isaac's house? It would have saved a lot of trouble for Jacob. But Jacob is learning through all these things that he can trust God. His faith is increased with every trial. 3. God works on our behalf, guaranteeing the promise. First, think about the weakness of Jacob's faith. He actually thought shaving sticks would give him an advantage in securing the blessing. We might wonder why God would bless through all this. It is because he wanted to. No one can stop what God has promised. If he can add and take away spots on the goat and lambs, he can give to us what he promised. Our thought to remember states, count your blessings and thank the blesser. Prosperity comes from the Lord, not from our ingenuity, hard work, or breaks. If we prosper, it is because God has prospered us. You may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you the ability to produce wealth. All we have belongs to Him and must be used as He directs. That's the way we should thank Him. Our lesson next week is entitled, Love and Obey God. Our biblical reference is Deuteronomy 6:1-9. We are truly glad you spent time to learn this week's lesson with us. We hope you are blessed and may share these with somebody else. We wish you can join us at the Cubao Church of Christ soon. Our congregation is a place to discover faith, find new friends, grow closer relationship with Christ and serve with each other's gifts. Thank you very much, have a great week, and God bless you always, dear brothers and sisters.